Hi, my name's Andy Hodgson, and I want to take this next minute to chat to you a little bit about the Emerging Leaders Program and why you should consider it for yourself, for the leaders you're developing, or as a partnership for your church or ministry organisation. You know, before sending out the 12, Jesus says, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field." We still believe this to be the case today, and that's why we want to equip and train disciple-making and movement-building leaders to be sent, so that we may see disciple-making movements launched in all church and community contexts across Australia. The Emerging Leaders Program is an opportunity for leaders to establish their leadership now and to impact their future ministry. Our heart is to equip, train, and launch generations of leaders who think movements like Jesus did, who live authentically as disciple makers in their everyday life, and who are known to be kingdom-minded. We explore the life of Jesus as our model of leadership and lifestyle. By journeying through Jesus' life chronologically, we discover his priorities, his methods, his mission, and his model. And then we work hard to help to implement these priorities in your personal lives and ministries that you lead through coaching, mentoring, and practical application. In addition to this, we recognise the importance of accredited biblical and theological studies. So through our partnership with ACOM, students engage in academic study anywhere from a higher ed diploma through to a master's. We also further explore specific leadership skills for today, and we do this all as a learning cohort. And so we'd like you to consider being a part of any of our programs so that you can be equipped, trained, and launched. So together we can see disciple-making movements through your life and leadership.
Partnership with other churches is the key things that define it. But one of the things that I've noticed is you can define that and still have quite a wide variety of what that looks like. And so we've ended up making a list of things that I wouldn't call them values as much as realities. So I don't know if the word mantra is something that you guys use very often when you think of, these are the... I'm a mum of musical theatre people. You can probably pick that by the mantras that I've found, Hakuna Matata, all those sort of sayings that you use in a context that are just like, they mean a lot. They kind of summarise your approach or your ideal. So we kind of came up with these mantras, and in part we came up with them because we kept saying them to each other a lot, and some of them became jokes, and then we kind of put them together. So these have been kind of some of the key mantras, and they kind of underline, I guess, the values, but also the culture of what we're trying to create in a microchurch. So the first mantra is adapt and learn. And I think it's one of the real advantages of the microchurch is to think about that ability to actually have that agile approach and move and change as you go. If you were going to take, say, a church of 200 people and say, okay, we're currently, I use this with City Life, we're currently a big church in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. If we wanted to move from reaching, middle class Wanturna to reaching bikers, how long would it take to move that church? If you're a church pastor, that sort of change would take months, years, maybe a year to get through that process. If you've got 20 people and you say, hey, we sense God is no longer asking us to reach these families, he wants us to reach these bikers, well, to be honest, I could probably have those conversations on the phone during the week, have one meeting where we actually talk about it, and then the next week we could be focused on it. So there's just an ability to shift and change. But there's also an importance of learning. And one of the things that, I'll go through it in more detail later, with microchurches is that because they're so contextual, there's always the importance of actually learning from your context and learning how you best engage in that context. So how you make disciples with teenagers as part of the Notting Hill Neighbourhood House is different from how we made disciples with families around Jells Park. They're different people in different contexts, and our approach needed to be different. And so it requires that constant desire to learn. Be real was one of the ones we used, and we actually use this in our community particularly to call people out on. Come on, are you being real with us about, how you going? How's your week been? Yeah, good. You being real? How's your week? I'm genuinely asking, because I think we have this practice almost in our communities of being a little bit surface, and we really wanted to dig deeper. So that was one of the kind of mantras. But it's also, I think when you're talking about mission, and I think I was sharing with the Nottingham Neighbourhood House and our heart for that, it's got to be real. You can't just say, oh, well, there's, this population in the corner of our church, or let me get back on the screen, sorry, online people. There's this population here of people who like to go mountain biking, and I hate mountain biking, but I want to reach them for Jesus, so I'm going to go mountain bike. But people pick that up, right? So the importance of actually being real and true to what you're on about. Context matters, and this is one of the advantages, I think, of microchurches, and one of the really important messages of microchurches is this is not copy and paste. This is not the latest church growth method. It is not the golden ticket to get everything to reach people in your community. This is purely and simply, it's about responding to Jesus in your context. What is God asking you to do, and how you're responding in obedience to that. In truth, that's kind of how we started in our kind of missional community journey. I think I was sharing with some people at lunch. It was literally Jesus encouraging us to go outside of our walls of our church, and so we stepped in and did that. And then it was like, well, we think Jesus is saying something about Gills Park, so we stepped into doing that. We didn't know what it would look like to make disciples in that space. We didn't have a plan to multiply this out and then eventually have church plants and congregation plants. We just knew that this is what Jesus was calling us to, and responding in that context. And I think it's all very contextual. So taking what someone else has done and trying to run it in your context, it won't work. It just genuinely won't. I've seen people do it. There is so much of this that is about how we respond to what God is doing. And if we believe that it is God's mission and He's at work in the world, then it's our job to actually work out where is He at work and how do we partner with that. And He is at work in Glen Waverley in different ways than He's at work in Doreen or in Mernda or in other places around. So how is He at work in this space, and how are we partnering with Him? The other mantras we have around going together. So we don't believe in solo missionary heroes when it comes to microchurches. Jesus never sent people out on mission on their own, and I don't think we should either. So whether that's as the leaders of a microchurch, whether that's just generally, if someone's going out to have dinner with someone that they've been talking about Jesus with, we encourage them to take someone else with them. What does it look like to go together in all that you do? Which requires a life that's actually lived together and lived on rhythms that actually mean that there's a lot of crossover in that community. The biggest pushback we've had with missional communities at times has been a push into program. So, on Thursday nights we do our discipleship space. On Saturday nights we do our kind of outreach and our worship space alternating. And that's our program of our missional community, rather than seeing it as this is a rhythm of life that we live together, where we cross over into one another's lives, where we, we're in contact relatively regularly, where we engage, and we're doing that life together. Because I think if you look in the book of Acts, particularly it happens 3 times in the book of Acts, but in that Acts 2 chapter from 42 to 47, where there's that picture of Christian community, they are in each other's pockets. They are doing life together. They are giving each other had need. They really have this sense of we're in this together, in all of it together. And I think that's a really important thing with microchurches, because if we hold that individualism kind of stuff too strongly, then we end up with just programmed microchurches. Again, keep it simple, lightweight, multipliable, and easy to communicate. So if your microchurch takes 3 sentences to explain to somebody what you're doing or where they can come meet you, it's probably too much. We meet at the neighbourhood house and we're there every Thursday night. Come and join us. How do you keep it simple, not just in what you're doing, but in your ability to be able to explain it to others? So when we talk later about a missional vision, or what's your vision for that community, how do you explain that in a way that is simple and clear and ideally without the kind of Christianese? And then the last kind of cultural mantra that we talk about is multiplying disciple makers. I'm not just talking about making disciples, because making disciples is a good thing, but we want to make disciples who make disciples, right? So we want to actually see that process multiply on. And I think if I was just making disciples, if my focus was just on that one generation, then I could use, a whole lot of tools that I've got in my tool shed and just help grow that person. But if I'm starting to think, how do I grow that person to grow another person, then I'm quite careful and thoughtful about actually how do I teach them not only what they need to know around this or how they shape their life around this, but how do I teach them to teach others in that process? So how am I not just helping them with the outcome of the tool, but how am I actually giving them the tool to teach others? So we use things like discovery Bible studies and tools like that in order that they're simple, they're easy to understand, they're easy to multiply, and they're easy for others to carry forward. So they're some of the cultural markers. So if you add the kind of things that are the shapes along with the cultural markers, you get to see this picture of kind of the DNA of what's coming together. It's simple, it's small, it's multipliable, it's got that missional identity, it's got a heart of multiplication and partnership, but it's also about being real, contextualised, simple, community-orientated. And so it's when those two overlap that you actually get, I think, the more healthier versions of a micro-church. I flipped this in here because you'll notice my language at times changes, but also because I think this is a big question that we're seeing a lot of people ask. What's the difference between missional communities, micro-churches and house churches? And the answer is probably not a great deal compared to just depending on what your definitions are. But the real difference is, A, is it considered a church in its own right? And B, does it have its own leadership or eldership and things like that? So missional communities is a really common term, and they're often used when they're not a church in their own right. So when it's a ministry of another church, so to be honest, what we planted it to start with at GWAC was missional communities, because they were a ministry of the local church, and at that point the local church didn't see them as a church in their own right. Now somewhere in our journey that changed, and they did see them as a church in their own right with their own kind of leadership and eldership and things like that. Micro churches are ones that are seen as a church in their own right. They have their own leadership, and they often have a team of elders or some sort of governance structure. House churches, there's not a lot of difference these days between house churches and micro churches, other than house churches don't often have that missional agenda behind them. So a lot of house church movements, depending on which ones you look at, more so, certainly in the Western Church, are more so around gathering for community than they are about focused mission or collaborative mission. They're more about gathering for community and then sending people out to their workplaces to do whatever mission they're doing, whereas micro-churches tend to have that more shared missional identity. I say that, but some of the most missional house churches are in house church movements in China and Myanmar and Afghanistan. So the movements that are going on in those places at the moment are extraordinary. Afghanistan particularly so. It's one of the most thriving house church networks that's happening. It's incredibly missional. But when it comes to the kind of Anglo-Saxon versions of house churches, they tend to be far more inward. And so that should give you, I guess, a bit of a picture of what micro-churches are, both their elements, the kind of culture, and how they differ. Is there any questions on the what is a micro-church? And then we'll actually move forward into kind of how we launch them.
So when you meet on Thursday at the
Neighbourhood House,
the neighbourhood house, you do Bible studies, is that correct?
It just changed, but yes, we have been doing a discipleship group on those nights. So it's not a Bible study. It's a space that we use to intentionally disciple one another into what is God saying to us and what are we doing about it.
Okay.
So I'll talk about the form a little bit later,
Yep.
but it's a space where those who are leading have been coming together, and we have a meal together, and then we'll actually there's an expectation that we're doing our own reading of scripture and things like that. We will have something in terms of content or training, and then we will have a time of kind of group coaching around our discipleship journey, where we're up to and what we're stepping into.
And there's 3 leaders that work together?
Yes, there's 3 in our core team.
Yep. Okay. Do any of you get paid? Or is this
No.
free? No.
Yeah, no one
So
gets
where
paid.
we sit, we study.
Yeah. So the lady who leads the network gets paid.
Yes.
She's getting paid 4 days a week.
Yep.
And I got paid half time at GWAC to lead that whole network that you saw on the screen. So I think the role of paid pastors when it comes to micro-churches is in leading and resourcing those networks and hubs.
Okay.
Yeah. So instead of being the person doing the ministry, we are equipping the saints
Others
to do the
to
work
do
of
the
ministry,
ministry,
which is
yes.
in, Ephesians 4 somewhere.
And then 10, and we
Yeah.
within a community zone.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're in a community, and our church planter is in a community as a follower of Jesus, because that's what we're called to do, not because that's her paid role.
Yes.
Her paid role is in facilitating the network and
Yeah.
resourcing and supporting the network. Yeah.
Okay.
And training, and leadership training and stuff like that. But I'll talk a little bit more about what that involves. You're right, in a little bit. So, so there's some, it's definitely a shift in rethinking the role of the pastor, depending on what sort of church you've come from. So where I was at GWAC, it wasn't a big shift because we would only pay staff to do what we would call equipping roles. So roles where you're equipping other leaders to do. So we didn't pay staff to do ministry. So even in our youth ministry team, our youth pastor was paid to support a team of leaders and to coach a team of leaders who ran the ministry. But they weren't paid for just to run it, which is a bit different to some other places. So it was an easier shift for us to make because we were already one step down the path. Whereas some other churches I've been involved in where it's the pastor does the ministry, it's a much bigger shift to move towards that kind of resourcing and equipping role. But I think you can see it in what Paul was doing in his life, that there's a fair lot of that sort of equipping work. So, any other questions? Anyone online? Wave at me if you've got a question you want to ask.
Sorry, can I?
Yeah.
Just in terms of like elders.
Yeah.
What does that look like, I guess, compared to like eldership in like a bigger congregation?
Yep.
As opposed to a micro-church?
Yeah, so it depends. It looks like different things. Let me give you the structure of what I tend to do. So each of our micro-church has a leadership team, and we also have what we would call spiritual parents, which function in the role of elders for that particular micro-church. Now, our micro-church network then has like an eldership board, parish council, whatever terminology you lead, that guides the network. So that eldership for us is about the kind of broader spiritual direction, strategic direction of the whole network at that sort of level, but it's also about the child safety, the finances, all the other bits that elders tend to deal with in that space. So it's kind of a combination of the elders as the spiritual directors, which comes from some traditions, and the board CEO. So we've kind of combined both into one structure, but leave the operational decisions to the staff. So it's really about the spiritual direction and property and finance and anything we could do to kind of release that from others. But then each one has its leadership team and usually a couple or one or two people who are spiritual parents, which is like what we would call our local eldership. Because it doesn't make sense to have, if you have local leadership team, which is your core team, which is usually 4 or 5 leaders depending on how many are in each household. Then if you were to have elders, you'd have more than a missional community in that. But we actually learnt the value of spiritual parents when we were doing youth ministry communities. So we'd have these youth communities that were, a leadership team usually had 2, maybe 3 young adults and 2 or 3 youth, and that was like the core team of each one of these youth missional communities. But there was just a few issues in some of them where young adults weren't the wisest people to advise youth on what they were doing. And so we kind of imported these. And a lot of the time, because they were meeting in households, the parents were starting to step in that sort of role. And some of the youth leaders were annoyed about that, and some of the youth didn't like it. And so we actually worked through a process of formalising that and say, actually, no, if they want to, they can step in as spiritual parents and have that role. And it was probably the one thing that I could point to that I said, I actually think this really strengthened the discipleship in our youth communities, but also helped them grow. Like we used to have, these youth communities used to meet at different houses, and the parents, spiritual parents would invite their community to come for dinner beforehand. And the amount of kids who would send, feedbacks or comments or things in to let us know how much they valued sitting around the dinner table with these other families was, mind-blowing. It didn't even occur to me that wouldn't be a regular practice for most people, but it was a real kind of eye-opening. So that's where we kind of bumped into this spiritual parent idea. It was an accidental find within our youth communities. And we didn't have it when we ran a single adults community. So we had this young adults community that started up in our very early days. One of the ladies who came to me when we were just discerning what we were doing, she's like, I think we should do missional communities and I want to run one. She wanted to run one for single adults in Camberwell, which was a great idea until they weren't single anymore and they started dating within the community, and then they didn't start dating, and then they stopped dating, and it became actually a really unhealthy space. And I remember our reflection on that was, gosh, it would have been good to have some spiritual parents like we do in the youth ministry in there. So we started popping them in pretty much every microchurch. So they work as elders in that sort of spiritual guidance, wisdom space. But as networks, we then have a proper elders board on top of that. Any other questions people wanted to throw at me at this point? Yeah, you're right. It will be different for every single one and depend on what they're doing. Some of the common elements is food. Pretty much every microchurch I know meets over a table or around a table, and hospitality is actually a really key part of this. I think there's a beautiful welcome in welcoming people around a table that's really important. I think it models that welcome that God offers us. So that's really key. I mean, it depends. Some of our missional communities or microchurches meet in some very kind of clearly delineated spaces. So some of them will meet and have, this is our worship gathering, and they'll still have songs, they'll still have someone do something around like a Bible, they'll have a Bible reading, and then they'll have some sort of open discussion. Very rarely do you have a sermon in a microchurch. It's almost always a guided discussion of some sort, or if you've got kids, you use some of the godly play stuff or the fresh expression stuff to kind of unpack passages. All of the I wonder questions and things like that has been a pretty key approach. And then there'd be times of, praying for one another. Now that would be probably the microchurches that have come out of traditional churches would look more like that. A lot of the others look far more blended. So they'll start around the table. And so what we do when we gather for things that are more intentionally around our teaching spaces, we'll gather around the table and there'll be a couple of questions. So before we say, even like as saying grace, we'll say one thing we're thankful for each around the table. That would start a conversation. There'll be a couple of questions on the table intentionally to start the topic of conversations for the evening, and our whole evening would happen around that table. So we wouldn't kind of divide it up like other people. There'd be a discussion, there'd be a chance to close in kind of praying for one another as we go out this week. And so it would be a very blended, natural, and we wouldn't do music, but we've got other communities that would. As you can see from our original communities, my daughter used to lead music. So those sorts of gathering spaces, some can look like a Bible study still. Like if that's an element of what they do, that's great. There's a community that's older people, and that's one of the weekly gatherings they use together is they gather and they study the Bible together like a typical traditional Bible study. But the other gathering they do during the week is out in nature and actually taking people for walks to kind of admire God's creation and connecting with people that way. So they look like anything and everything. It's really about how do you contextualise and embody the gospel for that people group. So yeah, could look like anything. But Fresh Expressions has some good examples on their website too if you want to find some more examples. Are there any questions that you're left with about microchurches before we talk about how we launch them? Is there any other things that people wanted to flag or say, actually, this bit I don't understand? I won't leave us to do a discussion, so I think we'll keep going.
I definitely am struggling to grasp it.
Yeah.
So, and I've not even been a Christian all my life. I've been told, I've grown to appreciate the, going in and the 3 songs and the communion and the prayer and the...
Yeah.
I work in kids' min, so I am out 90% of the time with kids, and I love that space. But when I'm back in the church service, I miss it. I do. I love So I am struggling, and I'm open to keep listening and to see how you were being fed sufficiently. differently in a different way.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, yeah.
Yeah, it's a very common kind of question and thought that people have.
Yep.
And the question is, what does it look like for you to be fed as a Christian? And not a direct question for you to answer necessarily, just because can you be fed as a Christian and grow as a Christian by going out on mission together?
Yes.
Yeah. Yep. Can you be fed as a Christian by eating around the table and listening and learning to listen and respond to each other and our challenges of life? Yeah.
Yeah. As
Yep.
long as as long as we've got an intergenerational.
Yep.
As long as it's not just one group of
Yeah.
people that are all this similar lifespan.
Yeah.
Then I think yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And even though, so for example, our community with teenagers, one of the couples that's a cool couple, don't have kids. Actually, they're pregnant, but they just have a heart for teenagers. They have a heart for Notting Hill. She's an ex-youth pastor, and so that's part of their passion. But I mean, the single adults community taught us that we don't just want one and the same demographic in the same community. We learnt that one the hard way, because that was a bit toxic.
Yeah.
So most of our families one. So our families one that we did down at Gels Park, we had a lady called Margaret who was probably in her 80s and in a wheelchair, and she was like the grandma of the group. She wasn't the person that we'd appointed as the spiritual parents, but she kind of played an extra role. And my kids didn't have grandparents in town. Like my parents live in Caloundra in Queensland, and my husband's parents, they live in Melbourne, but they're not very present. And so it was a real blessing to have them in that space. So I think the intergenerational space is probably the advantage of micro-churches. Even when you're trying to reach a primary school, you would usually end up having a range of people involved, depending on their interest and areas. We've got one at the moment that's a bit too... It's come out of Monash Uni. It's now people who are kind of finished uni and first-time workers. And it's pretty much all people who have finished uni and are young marrieds and workers, other than one couple. And for me, it's not quite where I'd like it to be. I think it just lacks some depth and maturity in that space. But in terms of feeding, I think the one thing that we're really particular on is the process of discipleship. What does that look like? How are we making disciples, and being really intentional about the accountability around that? Because I think most people in churches know a lot more about Jesus than they have learnt to embody.
Yeah.
Right? And actually, we can talk a lot about Jesus and we still can't live it. Whereas the processes that we use and that I think are generally used in microchurches are really focused on actually, how do we embody that? How do you actually start living that out and letting that make a difference so your life looks more like Jesus? Because I think we've kind of, I don't want to say we've swapped it, because I don't think we've swapped it, but we've kind of seen discipleship and all the courses like 101, 201, 301 haven't kind of helped our mind. Discipleship is not getting people to know a lot of stuff. It's getting them to make their lives look more like Jesus. So it's not about, it's not all about knowledge. It's actually about embodied kind of whole of life that actually starts to mirror Jesus' life, right? Some of that is knowledge, and we talk about it in terms of head, heart and hands, right? So some of it does have to be head.
Yep.
Some of it actually needs to be heart transformation, and some of it needs to be actually, we need some discipline and some will to actually do what Jesus has asked us to do. Even if the head and the heart don't want to join in, right? Sometimes we just need to learn to do what we're called to do, even when it's hard. So it's just straight up, obedience in that sort of stuff. So, I think between our kind of discipleship groups and our gatherings where we're actually discussing scripture, for me, that's all I can manage to process and put in a week. And I'm a doctoral level theology student, and that for me is enough. So, I don't think it's a lack of being fed, but there is a real push in these micro churches to encourage people to be self-feeding as well. So not that we don't do it, but that our discipleship group is keeping you accountable. Here's our reading program that we've all agreed to read through scripture like this together. What's God been speaking to you this week? So that's the kind of level we start at which can sometimes be confronting for people coming in. But actually, to be honest, our new Christians who come into that space go, oh, you all read the Bible every day. Okay, what am I reading? What have I got to read? When do I read it by? What do I have got to do? How do I respond to that?
Yeah.
And it's just culture that we're not teaching people to rely on us for their daily bread.
Yes.
You know,
Okay.
we're teaching them to self-feed and then holding them accountable to doing that
Yep.
and to putting that into practice. Because it's usually what usually happens in our discipleship groups is someone will be, you know, reading through scripture, something will stand out, and they'll come to our kind of discipleship group and say, "This is what has stood out to me." And we'll be like, "Oh, that's interesting. What do you think? What do you think God wants you to do with that?" "Oh, I don't know. Nothing. I don't know." Like it's that. Like we can learn it. We can know that God's saying, "Hey, I'm actually calling you to be more generous or forgiving," but it's that process of going, "Yeah, forgiving who, and when, and how do I go and do that?" And or giving up this or sacrificing this, someone actually holding me accountable to doing it is what makes the biggest difference in making disciples. So I don't know. I guess it depends on what you mean by feeding, but I think if you have a really holistic view of that in terms of all of what you're doing is discipleship, then every time we gather with our microchurch, it's about discipleship. Yes, we call one a discipleship group, which is what we do with our leadership team and the core people. But really, we see everything that we do as discipleship. So, the guy who throws a tanty because someone stole his spade at the working pea, that's discipleship. And we just do it then and there, and we just talk it through.
Yeah.
So it's a very different approach, yeah.
Sorry, there's a question. How often do micro-churches gather?
Depends. Sorry. Our young adult communities like to gather 2 to 3 times a week, and I'm like, don't you guys have other things to do? What we tend to do as a microchurch or as families microchurches has often been that we gather once a week, but on an alternating kind of form. So every second Saturday night, and that might be our outreach or our worship space, and then every second Thursday night, and that's our discipleship space or something like that. So we find that in an official kind of scheduled gathering, it's once, maybe twice a week, depending on what else is on. But yeah, definitely we touch base with everybody at least once a week. But then if you're living, especially when you're living in kind of geographical areas that you're running microchurches, you kind of bump into people all over the place. And if they're at school, well, when we were doing it around a primary school, I was spending every second night back at somebody else's house having coffee after school pickup. Was that a microchurch gathering? Well, yes and no, not a structured one, but a touch point in community. So you end up with a lot of that kind of touch point, which actually, it brings up an important point, because one of the things that we had to do to really do this well was to declutter our lives of Christian events and contents and programs and things like that. So when we did this as a church, one of the first things we did after we started, so we did our first microchurch and kind of piloted it for a year. And as we started to roll them out, we realised straight away that this was going to start to impact other things that were running, and we didn't have the leadership necessarily to cover both. And to be honest, a lot of our really core missional people who were going to step into this were running 101 other ministries. And so we actually had to stop a lot of things before we started a lot more. So that was a big challenge, actually, to help people free up their lives, not just from church stuff. We did it as a family, from our 101 kids' sports activities and music lessons and all those sorts of things. For us, it was a decision of, no, our kids don't need to be, a superstar at this or that or doing 100 times a week, because we want to make space to interact with our community and our local community. And that means making space to be able to go back after school and have coffees and not have something on every night after school for the kids to actually do their activities. And that was, a sacrifice on our kids' behalf and on our behalf. They still did things, but we limited it to one activity each outside of school. Yeah.
Well, I do have a thought. I don't want it to come across as like, because I'm trying to get my head around a bit like what they're saying. It seems to sort of attract a certain type of personality or people with it. Well, you've sort of said like people with that passion will get into that and be part of driving it.
Yep.
But like people that don't have that passion, whether they come into the microchurch through becoming a Christian or carry people? Do you find that you end up carrying people, or you just keep challenging people to do this and do that, or do you say maybe go to the bigger congregational church and that might suit you better?
No, so I don't find that people who come to faith through this ever end up in that sort of, that kind of space.
Right.
Maybe because they're new believers. You know what new believers are like? They've got a lot of passion and drive to tell others.
The people that are healing fit.
Pardon?
Where are the people that are healing and the people that are in crisis? And
They're within those communities, I can tell you. Yeah.
yeah, and they're
Yeah.
okay within those communities.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. They're not everybody's forced to go out on mission, right?
Yeah.
So we hold these missional visions as a community. But I mean, so for example, some of the people that showed up with us at Gels Park Primary School, which is the primary school we went to the working bee at, one of the families that was with us then was recovering from quite a significant and serious domestic violence incident. And, you know, she came and served with us at the community because we're her people.
Yeah.
And there's a sense of community and belonging in that space. She wasn't pushed to, you know, go and share her faith at that space, but she was with us because she's one of us.
Yeah.
And so I guess you could call that carrying people. I call that community, right? As we engage in people, and especially as you're talking discipleship, as we start to disciple people who have no Christian background, who have come in through kind of our connections out in the community, you reach people who have got like all sorts of baggage and issues that don't, you know. To be honest, I don't think they'd be well supported in the church. I think they're better supported in a micro church because they've got a community of people around them who genuinely love and care for them. And they're not going to get like fixed or better or, I mean, they learn to deal with their situations, but they're still complex situations. And part of it, that's where the benefit of the wider church comes, especially when we've had some mental health complexities and things like that, where we've got people in the broader church to actually, who have got some more expertise in that area to come in and actually help us and engage with people in certain spaces and organise referrals and things like that. But no, I think in those communities there's plenty of space for people who are not okay. I mean, I think there's more authenticity in those communities, so our own brokenness is a little bit more on display, so it's okay for other people to be broken in that space. So, I don't know, I mean, we've had a lot of really messy, that's what I said at the start, it's complex and it's messy, it's just joyful while you do it.
I was coming from the angle that in our, say, like in our church example, we've plenty of young families.
Yep.
And all work, a lot of them are working full-time
Yep.
parents. And
Yep.
very time poor
Yep.
with young families, even just to be involved in our, in the local church. So
Yep.
they might be involved in one ministry, you know.
Yep.
That's just stretching them to the, so, I sort of try and understand how those
Yeah.
sort of types of families and people, how do they fit in?
Yeah.
You just sort of obviously allow, I don't know obviously, but you allow people just to go at their pace and be involved in it.
Yeah, and so the community I was talking about before that we're going to serve, we're going to go help out this family this weekend that's moving house. They're all young families.
Yeah.
But instead of trying to get a family sorted and ready to church on time by a certain time and then find space to be able to serve in a ministry, they're just showing up as they are to someone's home at a certain time, and in whatever state the kids are in, that's okay. And they're engaging together as whole families. And, you know, sometimes that means they don't get a lot done because the kids are all crazy and it's a bit messy. Other times they have some great discussions. It's, as a parent of, I remember being a parent of young children. Sorry, I'll get back on the screen. It's easier to kind of take my 3 rowdy children and just show up at somebody's house who I know loves them and accepts them no matter what, than it is for me to show up at church and feel like that they have to be in a certain cleanliness and orderness and behaved level, which we don't have at our microchurch. And it's, so for me, with young kids, I found that the easier one than engaging. And because it's so integrated, and because especially when we were like, when my daughter was in prep and was starting to do stuff with the local primary school, we were there anyway. So our life was integrated rather than this was what we did at school and then we had to add church and then we had to add a church ministry on top of that. This was all just around a local school. So it's actually, I found it easier rather than more of a burden. The families that we're dealing with at the moment in this other community that's part of the church that I'm being the interim for, I don't know how many families they've got in that community, maybe eight or nine families now, and they've all got like 7-year-olds and under. So it's like crazy. And they do some of the godly play stuff where they get some dolls and they tell a Bible story using like little wooden figures and put, costumes around them. And sometimes, like I've went once and it was chaos. But they do a trick that we used to do, which was roll a big thing of butcher's paper out and give people texters, and the kids would just draw and engage. And if that meant the adults got a conversation in the meantime, that was great. Sometimes the kids got involved with the story and they'd come up with some great answers, and even the kids, you'd be like, wow, where did that come from? And other times they'd be bouncing off the walls. And I still remember the day that we had a lot of young kids in our community, and we put on a VeggieTales episode because as adults, we just needed to talk in peace. And that was okay. The kids learned something, we learned something, and we called it a day. But there's something about the integration this provides with your life, rather than kind of separating things into buckets, that I think works well for kids and families. So, I don't know, other mums want to have a thought on, I don't know, what it's like to take children to church? So I don't know, I think there's a lot about microchurches that's hard to explain until you've been in it. And so to actually see it working, and actually so if we're going to multiply a microchurch, we insist that they've actually been in a microchurch first. That they get it, that they've been a part of it, that they've experimented, they've seen kind of what's going on, because it helps them. There's only so much you can teach before it's actually going to be caught, and you get an understanding of actually what does this look like. So I'm trying and put words to it. We'll see how we go, but yeah.
Are you also finding that the people that are a bit on the edge of church and like maybe less mature in their faith, they tend not to be a part of because they're maybe the ones that are hesitant to be constantly involved, and it's not so much of their lifestyle perhaps, or
I don't know. We had one of the communities that we had at GWAC. Their missional vision was to engage those on the fringes of church. They were a life group that decided they wanted to become a missional community, and they ended up somewhere. They weren't on my map that I put up earlier because they were kind of halfway between a missional community and a life group. But they were intentionally. There were two couples who ran it, who were intentionally reaching out to people on the fringes of GWAC who didn't come to church very much, and that was their missional outreach. Yeah. I'm like, sure, I don't know where it fits, whether it was a life group or missional community, but either way, it's a great idea. It's an important thing to do. And there are people on the edge of the church because of lots of history and conflict and challenges, and people who probably weren't going to walk back into the church building, but weren't anywhere else. So, so this lovely couple who that was their heart, so they did it. I don't know. I think there's a blend between those two.
The question was, where is the disciplined reverence for God come into it?
Yeah. Well, all the way through it, in my view, but depends what you mean by that. There is always spaces that are really intentionally set aside for worship in some spaces. Now, if you're talking about kids, they're not always quiet, reverent spaces as we might define them. We had this, on Sunday, we had this kind of extended worship time where we went up to the country, and it was a time of just adults, and it was a time of prayer, of sung worship, and of kind of waiting on God and prophetic words and people sharing scriptures and things like that. So we do that. We try and make sure they're once a quarter. So that was something that we did on Sunday as a space. We call them times of kind of extended worship or waiting on God and things like that. So that's something that we've been built into our rhythms. I saw the thing about, I think the question said something about order and discipline.
Is there a time and place for order and discipline?
There is, and so when our missional communities gather back together, whether that's kind of a fortnightly or a monthly rhythm, and when we gather all in together, our expression is far more ordered, because it has to be, because it's larger. And so in that space is more typically like a typical gathered worship kind of space, even if sometimes we'll still have a more interactive teaching, so we won't have a 30-minute sermon, we might have 10 minutes and then a breakout into to talk with people around you and then another 5, or, it's a bit more of an interactive teaching style. but it's a much more ordered worship. So, tends to start with a few songs and a typical call to worship and prayer and that sort of stuff. So there are spaces where we do that when we come together in larger groups, but there's less order and discipline, I think, within micro churches as such, because they're smaller and the need for it isn't there. Okay. Any other things people want to throw around?
Do you think, just following on to what Josh was saying before, do you think it's easier to connect people that haven't had a church background into a micro church as opposed to a larger church context?
I think it's much easier to connect them into that space, yeah. Yeah, I mean, and that's, to be honest, it's part of the motivation, what led us to, because as a church we weren't reaching our local community. We were getting good at getting transfers from other churches because we were bigger and better and we had bigger and better programs, but we weren't really reaching people who don't go to church. And we've seen micro churches reach to both, I guess, the de-churched, so those who used to go to church but for whatever reason stopped going to church, and the completely unchurched. I've seen more effectiveness with it, and this might just be generational, but the completely unchurched that we're reaching are mostly young adults, so under 30s, and that might just be generationally because a lot of people over 30 do have some sort of church background, but we do tend to reach a lot of the young adults who are completely unchurched, who have no church background at all, whereas those that we're reaching who are families, they've often got some connection with the church, and I don't know if that's just culturally because a lot of Australians did have some connection with the church, or just the people that we're seeking to reach or trying to reach. That just seems to be who we've picked up, and also we're in kind of middle class Glen Waverley area, so most people probably, if you go back 20 years, were in a church, even if it was just as a teenager. So we reach a lot of people who went to youth groups and no longer go to church, and that's often a point of conversation because we're all old youth pastors. So
when you start the micro church, and I'm thinking about Monty as well, if
Yeah.
it was to happen, how much impact did it have leaving yourself and other families who I'd imagine were probably heavily involved in church life?
Yeah.
The impact then on the church, because I would imagine if it happened at Monty that you'd be losing not the quieter people that don't do much, but you'd be losing.
You're losing some of your key people, So we took there was 5 families, so our family plus 4 others, and they were doing this kind of Saturday night expression of kind of messy church, trying to do it in a big building with just these 4 families. So that's kind of who we took with us on the first one. And we didn't really take any more out of the kind of central church. Then we're a church of 500 or 600, so 5 families was a bit like... The big one that I took was the lady who was part of that, who was also the coordinator of the playgroups. And for a little while she did micro churches and she did the coordinator of playgroups. But then she stopped being the coordinator of our playgroups because her kids had been much older and she was very invested in the micro church around their kids' primary schools. So that was a big loss. The other one that probably was a bit of a different sort of loss is when we started them with young adults. So when we started micro churches with young adults, we used to have a young adults ministry and we started micro churches alongside of it, and very quickly all of our young adults got involved in micro churches. That was they just like swamped to them, and so we had no other young adult ministry. All of our young adult ministry was micro churches. So for a little while we had a bit of one of the communities we had, the fitness one, was kind of like a catch-all for any young adults who aren't involved in any other micro church. That was the one that a lot of people were invited into. Different responses to different kind of generations. So when we started it with young adults, we started it with about 5 or 6 young adults, but they just all wanted to come and all be part of it. And so that really changed the shape of young adult ministry, but in part because they'd already been doing youth ministry. So they got it, they knew what we were talking about, they kind of got the picture of what we were trying to paint, and they loved what they'd done in youth ministry, so they all swamped. So we took the young adults out of the church, but they didn't come. They were still involved in the youth ministry. They were still involved some of them were still involved in children's ministry stuff who were wanting to be. So that didn't have a massive impact on the church. We didn't take like chunks of families out of it, I guess. But as the years went on and a couple of others started, we picked up a couple of other people, a lady who ran the craft group and a few people that went with her. But for us at GWAC, we said that the minimum that you had to come back in was once a month as a microchurch into the broader church. Some of them, and for a little while we made the mistake of saying everyone had to come back in on the same week, but that meant that once our missional communities grew, the children's ministry went from, say, 40, 50 kids to close to 100 on 1 week, but just for 1 week of the month, and then it would drop back down. And it was the most dysfunctional and disruptive thing for a children's ministry, and I apologise to all the children's pastors out there, because we just didn't think that went through. So in the end, we kind of said, make your own rhythms as a microchurch, just tell us what you're doing. And so some would come in on the first of the month, some would come in the third. It depends on what their mission was and how they were engaging.
What we were talking about, we kind of understand. So microchurch sounds like it's almost organised around outreach and trying to reach out to people. Is its goal to draw people in and point them towards like a traditional, consistent or stable church, or is it meant to be considered to be enough in itself, just sustaining someone?
Yeah, definitely enough in and of itself. So it's not aiming to be a halfway house between out there and a traditional church. So it's aiming to make disciples. And I would even say, I know it does draw people into the microchurch, but I would love it, the imagery to kind of be the microchurch moves out to, and we'll go to that in a second, into that community space and makes disciples while it's there, and then the church arises in that space, which is, I think, the ideal way that this happens. So the heart is for it to be making disciples out there without necessarily needing to bring them back into a church, because it is the church. And then multiplying from there. Because I think what we've seen happen, and I don't have any great reference from this, but you can kind of see it in the New Testament. I guess Acts 1:8 almost kind of says this, what will happen. But as we make disciples, so as we made disciples with young adults, there was a connection to a new group of young adults that we didn't even realise existed in Glen Waverley, which was like these really creative young adults who, I mean, we were focused on Glen Waverley, which is all highly academic and, you know, high achieving young adults, and we kind of ended up in this little subcategory here that was creative young adults who get kind of dismissed in Glen Waverley and kind of have this almost underculture of kind of creativity. So we kind of ended up with a community in there, and then that kind of leads to another community, and you kind of go down these like the veins, you're thinking of tracking like minerals and stuff through the earth. It's like one gives you to another, to another, to another. If we started at the centre at Glen Waverley and tried to reach young adults in that space without having gone through this space, then we had no credibility. We were so disconnected from where they are. So the aim is not to bring them back. The aim is to push them forward into whatever God might be calling them to work into. So it's like we talk about kind of pushing the power and the resources to the margins. A lot of our churches, we're trying to bring the power and the resources back to the centre. You know, here's where we have everything, and then we dole it out from here. And we're trying to say, and it's part what I want to do with Microchurch Australia, is how do we actually push, you know, any money, any resources from the centre to the margins, so that they're at the tips of each one of those nibs is all the resources they need to get a little bit further and to reach another group. That's kind of my heart behind it, is to see that kind of spread through whatever little tentacles go out throughout the place.
Jacob had a question, but Tom, you said you had a follow-up question?
Yeah, I just wanted to, so with that idea of pushing out through that space of multiplying outwards, my fear comes to mind would be, and what's holding it accountable to the true. Because with young leaders or people that aren't fully equipped or qualified, the idea of anyone who just kind of spread something, my fear would be there could be maybe things that are spread that should, like for example, if it starts with something that's true, but then it's carried out through people who don't implement a little bit in their head, and it's kind of running with things, how do we hold leaders accountable to something that means that, you know, we're not having, for example, a virus spread instead of the gospel spread.
Yeah, so various different processes that we've put in place for that, including kind of the key coaching, one-on-one coaching with the pastor or network leader of each microchurch leader. Then they're coaching their core team. And then we had, I'll get to it later, but we had like missional leadership training days that we'd run once a quarter, and every core team was expected to be there. That was part of us, part of the relationship that we built with them. And as part of that day, there'd be some teaching and some training, and then they would plan their next quarter, and they'd kind of report out, and we'd pray for them all, which they felt was really kind of, you're getting around us, you're empowering us, you're supporting us, you're praying for us, but we're also hearing exactly what you're planning for the next quarter, and we're able to actually step in and engage where we need to. So I think the key with this, which I'm jumping ahead a bit, but the key with this for leadership in Australia is that Australians don't like to respond to sit under leadership. But Australians are naturally a risk-taking and innovative culture, which is great for micro-churches, but the combination of those two is quite messy. Dale Stevenson's years ago set out some things like this when he was down at New Peninsula Baptist, and they went wild. So they were basically just set free to go and be a disciple-making movement and a missional movement, but there was no accountability put in place, and there ended up being some child safe issues and some other things that pop up. And one of those communities is still meeting completely rogue from any other accountability down around that space. And so the important thing I think to an Australian culture is not come over with, we need to control, we need to, keep power over. I like to see it as coming under and going, what do we do to put scaffold around these people? How do we support them? How do we make sure that we're in that kind of coaching relationship with them so that they don't want to go rogue? And so that if they're thinking about doing something, we've got such a good relationship responsibility, that they will come to us to talk to us about it first before they act on anything. And we managed to keep, we had 12 communities and 350 people in our network in 2018, so before pandemic's the last time we did the count. And we managed to hold all that together, but we had a huge kind of undercurrent of coaching and support that came under and around these people, to the point that nobody wants to leave that network because it was such a supportive space to be. In 2020, the pastor at our church changed, and the values and the direction of our church changed. And at the end of that year, so I did a year with this new pastor, and then I left. And officially, I think you'll find they tried to shut down the micro-church network. But you can't really shut down these sort of communities very easily. So now, unfortunately, it looks like they're all a bit rogue and unsupported. Thankfully, I've been able to connect a few of them into some other networks to be partnered with. But while we held that heart for coaching and support and coming alongside, Australians loved it. And there's some quotes and some thoughts on that from kind of secular leadership stuff around Australia, and that kind of heart that we like. We like this kind of, in leadership studies, they call Australian a kind of a captain-coach mentality. You're allowed to be my team captain, you're allowed to be my coach, but don't be the authority coming down on top. And I know in Christian circles, and theologically, there is a place for us to submit to authority, and we should. As Australians, I don't think we're very good at it, and certainly coming alongside and underneath with this kind of captain-coach mentality, I think, is a really helpful way to think about it. It was certainly how we managed to hold it together. So that's been our approach.
Well, Jake, I think it kind of culminates in the thinking at the end, but as a breakaway from traditional church, do you think the traditional church has a future? It's got a couple.
Yep.
I'll just say them all.
Yep.
And I guess, how do you ensure Jesus stays the focus and he doesn't get lost in the margins? And really, I think his focus of his questions and thought is around it being about Jesus as the focus.
Yeah, I think Jesus gets lost all the time in our traditional churches, to be totally honest. So it's one of those questions where you're like, yeah, what do you mean by Jesus at the centre? I hear you, and I think that's the role that the coaching and the leadership development and that sort of space, the discipleship space, plays, because we're asking that question constantly. What is God saying to you? What are you doing about it? How's Jesus at the centre of your life? We've got some kind of accountability metrics in that I think help people keep Jesus at the centre. And I think in part because we're on mission together quite regularly, conversations about the gospel and conversations about the work of Jesus are very common in our micro-churches, more common than I think they are in our churches at times. And so that helps us to keep Jesus quite centred in what we're doing. I can't remember, was there another element to that? Future of the traditional church, yes. My heart is this is a both and. I don't think micro-churches are here to replace the existing church at all. I think if you want to jump online, the Baptist Union of New South Wales has put out a great kind of vision for how they're going to see 1,000 new church plants, I think in the next 10 years or something like that. And they talk about mega churches, resource churches, community churches, and micro churches or simple churches. And they talk about the need for this mixed ecology, which is actually a term that comes from the Fresh Expressions movement in the UK. And they talk about the need for all of these different things to reach different people. There are a lot of people who are going to be reached from our traditional churches. And that's great, and they should keep doing that. And there are a lot of people in our traditional churches that are never going to move into a micro church, and that's great, and they should keep doing that. I think it needs to be a both-and approach, because there are a lot of people outside our traditional churches that are never going to be reached by our traditional churches. So micro churches are really going for the margins and the edges, where I think a lot of people are never going to, people who are never going to even consider walking into a church building. A lot of the students that we meet at Monash wouldn't have even thought of a church as a place that they would go even in a time of crisis before they met us. Whereas now, I think there are lots of people in our society today that if they have difficulties or if they were having a crisis of some form, the church would still be where they go, and we need that church to be there for that, and we need that church to be a welcoming, Jesus-centred, focused place for those people. So I think it's a both and I think we're seeing that with a lot of big churches are starting to do the both and model. So Crossway's been doing it for a while. So they have a mixture of kind of missional communities, micro churches, and obviously their existing church. I think I've frozen. Yep. And City Life stepping out. Oh, there we go. Okay, City Life's stepping out to do that as well at the moment, to run a both and I actually think that's what we need. And the Church of England in the UK, the diocese, particularly around the London area, for the first time has seen decline reversed because of these combinations of what they call fresh expressions, which are almost always micro churches or missional communities of some form or other, being combined with, that and dinner churches, and that combined with their existing church. And it's actually the both and model that's really worked well there. So I'll talk a bit more about that, but yeah. Yep.
I was just going to ask what you're talking about, that both and.
Yep.
In your experience, because obviously you've had a lot of different experiences with micro churches that aren't connected.
Yep.
In any way, and whether they've gone rogue or not.
Yeah.
But they're not connected, and then there's those that, for example, at GWAC,
yep.
you were there,
that were connected.
That had it connected.
Yep.
And I know you've talked about networks and micro churches and stuff. But in terms of your experience, where do you see kind of the not necessarily the best approach, but
it's in partnership.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's for me. That's why that's so key, because the most fruitful micro churches that I see are the ones that exist in networks, in partnership with existing churches or resourcing churches, or most of the single micro churches that I engage with that have just got one stay as just having one.
Yeah.
They're not the most fruitful. And a lot of the time when you see a single micro church like that, rather than a network or something linked to the church, it's often, that is where you sometimes see that, they move that way because they're disaffected, or, they've had an issue with the church or something like that. So most of the ones that are more intentionally planted are done so in networks or in connection with another church, and they're the more fruitful ones. So I actually think partnership is the best way forward for this. So let me flick forward, because I want to talk about, we'll talk through this pathway stuff, because I think this is a helpful way to think about how we actually go about starting micro churches. Because I think people's natural kind of view is, I'll just grab a group of people and we'll just go and do something, like we'll start a program. But the most fruitful micro churches don't actually start like that. Maybe if I get it. One more. There we go. This is something I've put together from our experience. It's also combining a bit of research that's come out of the US, where they've seen this kind of process of basically the launching of movements of a micro church. And what you'll see is there's markers and movements, and the circles are the markers. They're things that you can see. And I was going to write it up here, but The first one is that, you can see when Jesus is Lord of somebody's life, right? That is something that you can actually, someone from the outside can see and go, I can see the difference there. We can see when somebody's loving and serving in community. We can see when a community has a clear missional vision. You can see when somebody's making disciples, and you can see when there's an established microchurches, right? They're the markers. They're things that you can see. But what we've noticed is in between those, there are some particular movements that need to happen. So, for example, there's people who have come to faith, who have that sense of, yes, Jesus is Lord, I want to do something in my community. The microchurches that are more effective are the ones that go from that point to actually listening and loving and serving in community, rather than going, I'm going to start a microchurch, I'm going to pick up these 10 people and plonk them in here and say, there you go reach this people group. So there was an Anglican church a little while ago who decided they were going to do microchurches, and they gathered people up, they divided them into groups, and they sent them out and told them what their mission was. Guess what? It didn't work, because nobody had a heart for it, right? And if we're saying that this has got to come out of something that God kind of entrusts to us, that his Spirit leads us towards, then there has to be a sense of the process of actually discerning that and actually letting that kind of bubble up and arise within people. And so this process is really highlighting the importance of actually going in, loving, serving a community, and actually letting God kind of stir our heart for that community in that place, making disciples and letting the church arise, which almost is the opposite of what we want to do. Because by nature, we want to start a microchurch, and then we want to make disciples and reach our community, and it's almost backwards. But this has been something that we have seen over and over and over again. So I'll just walk you kind of through the key elements. It's not rocket science. Obviously, starting with Jesus is Lord. And it's actually, it's a really, really important thing to make sure that those who are leading microchurches do actually have that kind of as a centre of who they are. They have submitted their lives to Jesus as Lord and Saviour. Lots of people in Australia are happy to commit to Jesus as Saviour, but Lord is a whole nother thing, and that's why we've chosen that word to mark this process. Are they really willing to submit all of their life to Jesus? And you know what, microchurches aren't for everyone, because there's a whole lot of Christians, I think, who are just not willing to do that. That's okay. There's lots of other forms of church that might be good for you or for where you're at. But we're talking about when we release people as leaders of microchurches, that's what we're looking for primarily. There are other things, but primarily we're looking for a life that is submitted to the Lordship of Christ. That is, they are constantly saying, Jesus, what do you want me to do with my life? And they're acting in response to that. And it's a big call. But that's our starting point. And then we will find the next thing is actually about moving to listen. So if this is God's mission, if he's on about doing things in the world, if the church is called to participate in that mission, then that starts with us listening. Listening both for what is God saying to us in terms of through our community, whether that's through prayer working, which I said we did a lot with that Mandarin speaking community, whether that's through some cultural exegesis work, that kind of unpacking of what's going on in my neighbourhood, where are the places of grace, where are the places that are in need of redemption, what are the problems that we're seeing in our neighbourhood, how is our community actually working into that, actually starting to listen. And this is a skill that I think as Christians we really need to work on, actually listening to our community. There's a book by Leonard Sweet and Michael Beck called Contextual Intelligence, and it kind of embraces some cultural intelligence, but also talks about actually how do we read our context? How do we get a sense of what God is doing in our context and respond to that? And then obviously processes like cultural exegesis and things like that. But it's about listening for where is God at work and where is he asking me to step in, where is he asking us to step in. So it's a process that if you've just got one person who wants to start a microchurch, they can kind of start this process without necessarily having a team yet, or they can start this process with a team. But actually going through the process of listening and discerning, what is it that God is saying to me, what is God saying to us, what are we saying to one another? If I've got a missional vision to reach people at Notting Hill, but the rest of my team are passionate about reaching people down at Wheelers Hill or Glen Waverley, then we've got to do some listening at least to one another, if nothing else. And so the process says, yes, I submit my life to Jesus, and now I'm actually listening for where he's going to call me. Then there you go, close. Then it's about actually starting to love and serve in community. And while it kind of looks like on my diagram, this is the end of listening, this is actually a really key part of listening. And this is where, this is our story with the neighbourhood house, right? We started getting the sense that this is where God wanted us to serve. We saw that the neighbourhood house did a food program for students. And so both of us who were really keen on getting involved just jumped in and signed up and did our food safety training and came in. And it was like no place of peace. We thought, surely the neighbourhood house is running a food program. This is where they need help. This is where we can serve. We can meet students. We can engage with. And it was just like a brick wall. Like the other volunteers, the team was full. And so we'd put our name up on a roster and they'd be like, we don't need you this week. And we were like, it was like this all the time. We're like, God, we really thought the neighbourhood house was where we'd been walking around our area, really sensed, God, you want us to do something here. And we thought, we'd seen that, we'd seen their signs on the wall for the food program, surely he wants us in the food program. And we'd kind of made that next jump. And it wasn't until we actually started getting around the neighbourhood house and talking to them and listening and serving. And, we got involved with the food program, even though we weren't very welcome at times. We got involved with a couple of other days. They did like a youth market, a few other things they've done over time. And we just got involved and served where we could until we got a sense of actually the heart of the neighbourhood house. And it was through that kind of listening and loving and serving that we actually started to hear more of kind of God's heart for that place. We'll skip that one today because we're running out of time. Maybe we won't skip that one today. Jesus says no. But often what happens is you get to this space of liminality, right? And I've just shared with some of the others that my favourite author in this space is Susan Beaumont, who writes a book called How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going, which is like my, core book because I feel like that's my whole life. But she's actually coming to Melbourne. She's an American. She's amazing. So come to Melbourne and come listen to her speak. But you get to this space of liminality because we thought we were coming in and doing this food program and we were sure God told us it was this neighbourhood house. But then there was all these blocks and we were like, God, what are we doing? We hit liminality. We hit this space of going, we thought we knew, and guess what? We don't know. And it's this space of not knowing where I think God often actually helps us to see the deeper issues at the heart. That helps us to see a bit more of a sense of what he's really doing in this space and what we need to do to partner with him. Susan Beaumont's book talks about liminality and this space of kind of moving from knowing to unknowing, striving to surrendering, and advocating to attending, and just the importance of those posture changes for being able to discern what God is doing in that space. And it's only when we don't know what to do that we actually can hear what God is calling us to do. I think that's some pretty wise advice. She talks about presence and discernment as the posture for discerning and joining in the mission of God. And she particularly talks about liminal spaces as thin spaces. And that means spaces where it's actually easier to hear what God is calling you into because a lot of other things have kind of been pushed away. Things where you thought you might know are not there, or solutions that you thought, this will be the way, aren't there. So you're like, well, really, I don't know. And so it's a space that we often find it much easier to hear from God. And so there's this process, right? So Jesus is Lord, you've started to listen, you've got involved because you thought you might know where it is, you hit this liminality, and then you have this kind of high point. That's why it's up higher, because you get a sense of what God is really calling you to do. You get a sense that, God is stirring something in your heart. And as we heard the lady who runs the neighbourhood house tell us about what happened to teenagers in that area and the way they'd been broken up and kind of sent in separate directions from their friends they'd done primary school with, and just what that's done to the kind of teenagers in the area and the effects that she's seen of that. And I still get goosebumps when I talk about it. My heart was stirred. There's nothing I could do about it other than go, that's not okay. And these teenagers need to know that they're valued and that this space can be for them. And so there's a sense that you actually get a clear missional vision. And we actually do a process with a lot of our leaders called a vision board, which I'm happy to share with you, where we actually help them work through that vision. What does it look like? What is your missional vision? What passages are the key ones that you're holding on to for this space? We had when we were doing this with the group that was doing a lot of single mums, the passage they were really holding on to was the women at the well. And actually just the way that God used her powerfully, even though everyone else around her might have been judging her or certainly pushing her outside of community, Jesus held her centre and actually used her quite powerfully in that space. And they said that's the heart that they wanted for these women that they were reaching. And so we worked through this process, and part of a missional vision is actually coming up with, obviously some cool statement or something, but that's a bit irrelevant. It's really clarifying the heart behind it, and then clarifying what does it look like to make disciples in that space. So actually working out what's the process, or what are we attempting to do in this space, and how are we going to do it? What do the rhythms look like? So when we talk about missional communities and worship community mission, we often talk about that in terms of life rhythms. So sometimes there'll be monthly rhythms of doing something like our extended worship. Sometimes there'll be fortnightly rhythms of like our discipleship groups. Each community is different, but they work out those rhythms in line with that missional vision. So if our vision is to reach teenagers in Notting Hill and their families around them, how do we do that? What does that look like? And so that's the point of kind of getting to that missional vision. And then it's about actually at how do we step forward in action? And often you get to this great vision, like, I really know God wants us to do something. Now what? Like, I've got some ideas, and sometimes we often try like a few things, but that sense of what is not just God saying to us about the vision, but what is God saying to us about what the next steps are. So we'll often seek God for the vision, but do we seek God for the timing of the next steps? Okay, I know what it is, now I'm off. Actually, no, God, okay, I get this is your heart, I get this is who you're speaking into us, and this is who you want us to reach and engage with and love. How do you want us to do that? What's the first step? And actually taking the time to discern together that process. And it's about being responsive, it's thinking through timing, and there's a real habit or something that we're seeing in this as people step into action in this space, that there's often a lot of boundary breaking in this space. So as you've got that missional vision, if you sense that call from God, often it involves actually either crossing some boundaries or breaking spaces that don't usually come together. So there's a lot of courage involved in this, often trying these sorts of things out. Maybe. There we go. Excellent. And then there's stepping into the process of actually making disciples. So you're already serving in community. While you're serving in community, you've discerned that missional vision. And now as you're serving, you've discerned that missional vision, you're stepping forward into action. And in everything that you're doing, as you're serving these people, your aim is, in part, is to make disciples. How do you love these people? How do you help them to know Jesus? How do you help them to grow their lives to be more like Jesus, even if they don't know Jesus yet? And so there's, to a degree, that we disciple people before they're actually disciples of Jesus, in terms of we help them to grow in the values and the understanding of that as a bit of a first port of call. But everything that we do is contextualised around that particular group of people and starting to think through making disciples. And most of the time, that is a process of trial and error or rethinking. Some people use the term design thinking. It's that process of actually having to pilot something, learn from that, and then reassess and do it again. So as we've been making disciples, our current community, we thought we had a good group of people, and we decided we might do the Alpha course. Alpha has been something that's caused us to multiply communities before as people have come to faith. Guess what? It hit like this one like a ton of bricks. And I have no idea why. But for some reason, the groups of people that we're kind of connecting with, Alpha is just not personal enough. Even the new fancy film version still feels too churchy and disconnected from the relationships that we've built, and it just hit like a ton of bricks. And so we started actually using a Fresh Expressions version of the DBS, which is all around stories, and using the 7 stories of hope, and actually using that to actually tell the story of Jesus and talk through. That went really well. Can I tell you why Alpha didn't sit well on that? Actually, I haven't worked that out yet. Every other time we've done Alpha, it's worked really well with people. But with this group of people, it just didn't sit well. So I'm like, I don't know, you try, reassess, pilot, try something else. That's been part of our process for making disciples. What is 7 Stories of Hope? If you Google it, you'll be able to find it. It's kind of 7 stories of Jesus that people use to tell the gospel and to encourage people to respond. And Fresh Expressions, if you Google that, Fresh Expressions Discovery Bible Studies, they use some different DBS questions than the, what does it say about God? What does it say about me? What do I need to do in response, and who do I need to tell? Which are very clinical questions. The questions from Fresh Expressions, now we've only just started doing this in the last few weeks, are things like, could you see yourself in the story? What difference would this story make if it happened today? I've missed one. And then the last one is, what difference did this story make as you look back from the week before? What difference did the story make in your life this week? So it's really engaging in those stories and helping people to picture themselves and engage with Jesus in those stories. So it's a bit of an interesting approach. I don't know, I'll tell you in 6 months how it went. But at this stage, it seems to be more effective with the current group of people that we're working with. And that's the reality of making disciples, right? We don't make disciples in a vacuum. Everyone who we are talking with, everyone who we are discipling comes from a different position where they're starting from, and we need to work with them where they're at and work out what does it mean to take a step forward from there. And this is, I guess the story of, this is our missional community that we've had, or microchurch, for 10 years in various different forms. And for us, it's been a constant process of changing and readapting. So even though we've kind of had one microchurch that's extended all of that time, we've constantly multiplied other people off and revisioned and rechanged and readapted. And what we've done to make disciples in our early days, in terms of the only thing that stayed the same is our discipleship groups, but all the other content we've looked at has changed and been different. Alpha was fantastic. We multiplied from one community to 3 communities after we saw a whole group of people come to faith through Alpha the first time we used it. When we tried to do it this time, we got 4 weeks in and we thought, no, we're pulling the plug. People are just not engaging with it. And we're like, don't know why. That's okay. That's the process of learning and changing as we go. And that's been the journey of kind of our constant change. And then as you seek to make disciples with people, there's this process of actually engaging and doing life together. So it's not just the one-off meetings or the particular place that you're serving where you're actually starting to talk about Jesus, but you're actually starting to do more of life together as an integrated community, which leads you to have a microchurch, an established microchurch. As your community grows, you make disciples, you establish predictable patterns, and the community will be living out their missional identity, and you'll see aspects of your missional visions fulfilled. You have become a microchurch. And that's the process that we tend to see. And the final piece of that is about multiplication. Once we've kind of seen that microchurch established, disciples made, it's then about, okay, how are we multiplying that community? And actually it involves apprenticing leaders. So we are really intentional that, and most of the time, and I'm not doing what I practice when I preach today, usually I would have someone else here speaking with me. I was saying to some of the others that someone who often comes and speaks with me is actually sick, quite sick at the moment, so she's not here, which is why I've skipped some of the stories, because they're her stories, not mine. But yeah, so we aim to actually model that. Jesus did a huge job of actually, come stand beside me, watch what I do, learn from me, learn what I do, then you have a go. You know, he did all this ministry, and then he sends them out 2 by 2 and says, go have a go. Now come back, let's talk about it. How did it go? And then we go on again. And that process for Jesus was really natural. And I think it's really important. So in our microchurches, pretty much no one goes to plant a microchurch before they've been apprenticed in one for a few months at least. Probably 6 would be my ideal minimum. But they stand shoulder to shoulder. They come into the leadership team. Often what happens is they come into the leadership team in one and they'll plant as part of the leadership team in another one before they plant as the core leader of the next one. So it's like they're a member of the missional community, then they're a member of the core team, and then they might lead one. And so there's this process where they get kind of closer and closer to the centre and they get the DNA and work in that process. But it's definitely that process of kind of apprenticing. Multiplication is tricky because it's both about discipling and releasing. Christians are pretty good sometimes at discipling people, but it's really hard to release people that you've discipled for years. So I remember the first multiplication we did where we went in a few different directions, and these core families that we'd started with were going to all be in different communities. And I had put so much of my life and my energy and my coaching into these leaders that kind of sending them off was both exciting and encouraging and also heartbreaking, because I loved doing life with them and I loved seeing them every week. But I also knew that that was what God was calling us to do. And there was a sense of obedience to that. But that is pretty much one of the biggest things that blocks multiplication, is people who actually won't let go. So I've raised that person up. They've been my apprentice. I've been investing in them for 5 years. Great, you should have already sent them. If it's 5 years. Right, Jesus did 3. And we're not Jesus, so maybe we need 4 or 5, maybe. But you know, I've been investing in this person for a year. It's time to actually let them go. And that is one of the real things that blocks it. And the other thing is the balance of both grieving and celebrating. Right? How do you grieve that you are ending your journey with them? How do you celebrate what God has done in that community in that time? And how do you actually then commission them to move out into multiplication? And so you end up with this process, if you want to actually track the process of micro churches. Oh, you've heard about those. That looks like this. So you have at the very start, down the bottom there, this kind of pioneering micro church. So at the very early times, it's just the start of a micro church. It's kind of pioneering. People are starting to serve together. So when me and this other woman went to serve the food program, it was kind of the embryonic form of our micro church. It was just the 2 of us at that point, and we were just giving it a go and seeing what was out there and seeing how we go. As we kind of kept serving and started doing some other things around the neighbourhood house, we got out of the food program and we were just serving in some of the other ways. A lot of the other people came and joined us, so my husband and others who could come at those times because it was weekends rather than the food program, which was during the days. We ended up having 6 or 8 of us. We had that kind of start-up, and then we got the vision, and then bang, moving to actually work out what does that look like, and that kind of refining the vision, establishing a micro church, and then seeking to multiply it. So I guess, in part, the process is a process of micro churches kind of arising in context, where Christians are intentional about going, listening for where God is at, seeking to love, to serve, to make disciples, and let that arise. But it's also a process of, you can have a micro church at the start who commits to doing that process together. And so it can either be something that one person who has a heart or a vision, who sets out and starts, and as they are in that kind of loving and serving, they might find some others who join their team. They might even find other Christians who are already in that space, who are passionate about that space, who become part of their core team. So when I had people who'd come to me and say, I want to start a micro church, and I'd be like, great, let's talk about it. We'd pray about it for a little while, come back together, talk about, do you have a team? No. Okay, where can you start looking? Is there people around you that you think are passionate about it? No, you've tapped your church friends on the shoulder, none of them want to go with you. Well, where do you want to serve? Go there, see what's there. Just start serving. Don't start a micro church, just start serving. See what happens. See who comes with you. See who God brings along in your path. We've seen that happen a few times now, where someone's been passionate about, one guy who wanted to plant in a men's shed, really passionate about planting in a men's shed, but even in a large church that he was from, there wasn't the interest to plant alongside with him, which was a bit disappointing. But he went to the men's shed and he just started serving and loving this group of men, and then he found some other Christians in the men's shed. And they've kind of planted a micro church. And it doesn't really belong to any church or all churches, because they're all involved with some various different churches. But they're actively reaching this group of people in the men's shed, and they're discipling them at the men's shed. But it's Christians it's from Crossway, GWAC, and another small church, who all those people found each other in the men's shed and then started being intentional in that space. So, so the process is really that focus on actually, how do you go into a context, love and serve the context, listen for where God is at, make disciples and let the church arise. It's like, I don't know who's saying, I think it was Mike Breen saying, if you seek to build a church, you might get disciples, but if you make disciples, you'll always get the church. And keeping our focus on actually what it is to make disciples so the church arises, rather than seeking to build churches and then somehow try and build disciples into them. Are there any questions? I think that's it. Any questions on that sort of pathways, going about planting and multiplying micro churches? No? Let me flick to the last bit, and then you can fire away any questions you like at me. This is something that I've been working on a bit. There's not much in this yet, but there is an essay online that I've written for my doctoral subjects on a dual systems approach to microchurches, which is basically holding the traditional church and a microchurch network in tandem. So it's not necessarily microchurches who gather together once a fortnight or a month, but actually having two separate systems and holding those two systems in partnership, which is effectively what we did at GWAC. And while it was, to begin with, quite complex, and the two systems didn't necessarily get along well with each other, and there was a bit of issues between that, and I felt like the person standing like this, with one over here and one over here, what we learnt in the end was that actually they were really good for each other. And it was part of the reason that what we saw at GWAC, I think, went so well and we saw so much fruit was because of that dual systems approach. And it's actually, it's got a whole lot of older thinking to it. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Ralph Winter's work on modal and sodal spaces. It's kind of had a bit of a revival lately, but it's basically what led to some rethinking of kind of Christian missions ages ago in the 70s. And, what we ended up with, kind of all the missionary agencies and things that we've got came out of his ideas about modal and sodal spaces. So modal spaces are the kind of stagnant forms of church, like church structures, diocesan structures, whereas sodal forms are these kind of mission-focused, he called kind of like monasteries and mission agencies and all of that sort of. So he said there was these two kind of systems, and he justified it in his kind of theology based on larger gatherings and house church being modal, and Paul's missionary band being the sodal form of church. Now that's actually a bit problematic because Paul's missionary band is never referred to as church in Scripture, ever. And there's a lot of debate, and a lot of his work was thrown out because of this reason. People said, no, they're not a form of church, they're something else. But the other problem with Ralph Winter's work is that he collapsed both those larger gatherings that we see where all the churches come together and house churches both into modal spaces. And I actually think that's not correct either. A lot of the churches, the house churches particularly, were far more sodal, far more movemental kind of spaces than what the modal churches were. And it's something that's been coming up a lot because of what's happened in the UK. So the way they've held together the traditional church and then these other fresh expressions or micro churches or missional communities or dinner churches, like lots of different sort of expressions that are on the more sodal end. And the Archbishop of Canterbury basically made a statement that, a mixed economy of parish churches and network churches will be necessary in an active partnership across a wider area, perhaps even a deanery. And this statement was like ages ago, 2008, I think it was even earlier than that actually, but he actually made this decision that they were going to, as a diocese, accept both forms of church and seek to work together. And that's actually really revolutionised what they've done in the UK and the results they've seen. And this is some new research that's coming out of UK that actually talks about, instead of just the two that Ralph Winter was talking about, talks about a bit of a spectrum. And I actually think this is helpful because when we're thinking about church planting, micro churches, current churches, a spectrum like this is helpful to think about. Well, some are more definitely, and the labels below are more about leadership, but some are more on that modal space. They're very stagnant, they're staying where they are, they're serving where they are, they're quite a static form of church. And micro churches are often up the more sodal end. They move, they change, they adapt to whatever it is the Spirit is leading them to. But in between, there's actually a whole range of different steps. There's some church plants that are somewhat movable. Anyway, the idea is it's a process. It's not a set one or the other. And then I came across this work by John Cotter. Now, John Cotter is a leadership expert, and if you know him, he works a lot with change management. And he got to the point of arguing relatively recently that the rate of change that we're seeing now is so fast that hierarchical structures and businesses can't respond to it as fast as they need to. It is just actually impossible for a hierarchical organisation or business to respond to different movements in the markets and changes. So he actually advocated for this approach, and I found it kind of halfway through my time running this network at GWAC that he talks about a dual systems model. He talks about having that hierarchical leadership, and then he talks about having the network on the side. And there's a lot of research into this now in business around the importance of having both end approaches. One doesn't rule the other, one doesn't come subservient to the other, but they actually hold together in this space. And he talks about basically having a business, having people who kind of put up their hands and say, hey, I want to work in the one of these projects, and having this kind of guiding coalition that's finding all the new projects, things that need to be done, and then gathering teams to do those projects and getting people basically to opt in from the existing structure. And his 5 principles are here. He says that, his idea is that many people driving important change and from everywhere, not just the usual few. So really trying to get change driven in more locations from more people at a faster rate. A get-to mindset, not a have-to mindset. So nobody has to join this network. And I think that's an important thing when we're thinking about it in terms of its applicability to churches. No one has to, but they get to. They can if they want to. Action that's head and heart driven, not just head. So Cotter's really saying that this network has to be around issues that people are passionate about, that they're opting into, that they want to be a part of. More about leadership than management, and a partnership between the hierarchy and the network, not just an enhanced hierarchy. So the hierarchy ideally wouldn't sit over the network as well, that they actually hold the two together. And it's not actually a new idea. I don't know if anyone's done any work in social innovation, but it's a really common idea in social innovation these days, and they call it the bees and the trees. Right? The trees are the big organisations that have the capability and the ability to bring things to scale, and the bees are the small startups who have the cool ideas and can kind of get things off the ground. And so it's now best practice in social innovation to partner the two together, to actually get the bees with the guys who can scale them and get them working in partnership between this kind of usually hierarchical organisation and a small startup, and let the startup influence the organisation and the organisation actually help the startup to actually bring items to scale, to bring that kind of sociological change. So this is what it could look like. If you think theologically through the gathered church, house churches, and Paul's apostolic band. This is kind of one thing that we saw happening a bit when we were at GWAC. So yes, there was the mainstream church. Yes, there was all the micro churches. But what we noticed is there was a few people in the centre that tended to be the ones that would start new micro churches. So often they would start one, they would grow up disciples around them, and then they would move on. So our current view of church planting doesn't really look like this at all. So a lot of our church planting is actually about getting someone and they stay there for 10 years. But what we found kind of accidentally, and I think actually represents what you see Paul doing, is these kind of apostolic people would come alongside other people, they'd come in, they'd start a micro church, they'd get it going, they'd get a vision for something else, and then those people they'd disciple would keep that micro church moving and growing and staying a bit longer term than that one person did. And so that's kind of how we've come to represent it over time. And there's a theological essay you can read about that, but it's not that interesting. That's the main points of it. But what we learned was the importance of actually both systems sharing with one another. So getting the stories from the micro churches on the platform at the main church, just to share what's happening. Getting the micro churches to get the news from the main church so that they can hear what's happening. And actually getting some of those communication platforms going both ways is harder than you think. To get into the micro churches and the lounge rooms, news that's important and relevant from the kind of hierarchical church, and then getting the testimonies back. We learnt the importance of not trying to force change. When we first started at GWAC, I think there was a part of us that thought our whole church would become micro churches. We'd do the whole change, and maybe we're a bit optimistic or ignorant, either one. But the reality is there are some that are going to come on this sort of journey and are passionate about it. Great, bless them, send them. And there are others that are not. That doesn't make them any less valuable. That just makes them differently gifted, and that's okay. So don't force change on those who aren't ready, but do inspire it. We found that as we shared the stories back into the kind of traditional churches, they heard the kind of the stories from the margins and people coming to faith. Those who originally had been a bit more resistant actually started to get more passionate about it. And we saw some who originally had no interest actually go on to start and kind of come be part of the micro-church networks. And it was in part because they were inspired to do it, but they weren't forced to do it. So nobody said they had to, but they got to be. Invest where you see kingdom fruit and water wisely. This is one of the lessons you learn. If you have both of these networks running, you're going to be using more resources from your central church than you perhaps otherwise if you just ran a traditional everyday church. So that means you've got to make decisions about where do you resource. For us, that meant shutting some ministries down. Other times, I don't want to say we starved them, but we didn't resource as heavily the ministries that weren't as fruitful. So we made the decision to actually, we called it watering wisely, you know, putting the resources and the effort to those that were actually making disciples, and just pulling the resources from the other ones. So not staffing them with as many hours or with as bigger budgets, things like that, and actually just investing where we needed to. Seeking unity without uniformity, same DNA, different approach. It was really a place of conflict at GWAC for the first little while while we were running these two systems, because those in the existing system thought everybody in the network thought they were better than them. Those in the network thought they were outcasts from the original system. And actually helping people to see that both were valued, both were important, and it's actually about, we've got the same DNA, we're just going about what we're doing differently, and it's unity without uniformity. And that's really important messaging. It's not, hey, this is the thing everyone should be doing, they should be all going out on mission, and those who stay behind, well, you're just second-class citizens. That's going to cause conflict. It's actually about how do you actually hold the two genuinely in your own heart and in the way you speak, in your language. How do you actually hold those two together equally? And then it's about finding and investing in that apostolic band, helping them develop leaders behind them to hold the new ground. I think there's, I am someone who's more apostolically gifted, and there is a real tendency for me to just go and do and break through and keep moving, and not develop others behind me to hold the ground that we've taken in terms of that kind of apostolic leadership. And so it's important that you're actually not just finding those apostolic leaders, but maturing them to the point that they're actually learning to train up the leaders alongside them and beside them, and so that when they go on to whatever next thing God might be calling them to, that what they have built doesn't actually just dissipate behind them. Which I don't know if you've seen apostolic leaders but like that, but there's a few in my history that I've seen where they've started new thing after new thing, and then everything's just kind of fallen behind them. And really, there wasn't a lot of kingdom ground broken. So that might be it. Any questions about that? The holding the two systems together?
Where do you tithe? And how does tithing fit into it?
I'm building a new app for that. My husband's in IT, and we're building something called Scatter, which will hopefully be a all-in-one church management system for micro-church networks. So we do everything online. So with our micro-church network, so it all ties back to the central hub, and our decision is the central hub will say if we need to resource micro-churches with any money or something to do what they're doing. Most of the time, micro-churches run off zero budget. There's no need really to spend money to do what you're doing in community. Most of the time you can serve without spending much money. And so...
Do you tithe then?
Pardon?
Do you tithe?
Yeah. Yeah, well, because we've got someone who, well, A, I think it's a good spiritual discipline. B, because we've got someone who's actually a network leader. And so we've got a church of, 2.5 missional communities, and she's 4 days a week, fully funded for 4 days a week at the moment. Which is pretty good because that's not that many people to get her at 4.5 days a week. So that all goes to that central resourcing hub. I know other micro churches who are smaller networks that don't have someone paid who tithe into the centre and then they choose to give it away to different places. That's, I guess, one option. My theory is if you don't have someone on staff, you won't get beyond 5 micro churches. So my gut is that you need about half a full-time wage to support 5 micro churches. And what we're seeing in Australia is a lot of networks aren't making it past that because they don't have someone in that sort of role. Because the coaching and the resourcing and the training that it takes to multiply those communities beyond 5 is beyond what someone can do just as a lay person who's, working another job or something like that. So I think there is a place for that kind of paid ministry role, but it's in that supporting and resourcing the network, and so that's what the tithing's gone towards. Our micro church network also supports a local ministry which is the neighbourhood house, and a global ministry, which is a couple who are friends of ours that have gone out on mission. So we still, as a network of micro-churches, tithe again of our giving into broader global mission, which is a pretty standard practice in churches, I think, these days. So, but ours is all done electronically. So nobody ever puts cash in a bucket anywhere. But we do talk about it. So it's talked about in most of our gatherings. So, yeah. Are there other questions?
Just the consistency in teaching God's word.
Yep.
So, what does that look like?
Again, it depends.
Sermons.
Pardon?
Oh, sorry, I know you're saying we don't have sermons, but we
Yeah.
have discussion.
Yep. So as a network, we're currently looking at the book of Ephesians, hence why there's been a few Ephesian references today. And that often looks like when we're gathered, someone will lead us through, say, the start of chapter 1, and missional communities or micro-churches will go on and look at the second part of that in their own gatherings. It kind of depends. Some weeks what we do in our central gatherings is different to what we're doing in micro-church gatherings. We've made the decision for this season that we're all going to track through Ephesians, mostly because of what it says about our identity as children of God and as the church and what God's calling us into. We think that's a helpful thing to refresh as a whole community. So I tend to write the teaching series for our network, which include a mixture of, gathered Sundays where we're doing something more intentional with a stronger upfront teaching focus, and then scattered Sundays. And so I'll actually put resources together. Micro-churches may not use everything that I send out, in part because I can be quite an academic, so I can send a lot of stuff out, but they get to choose from those resources and use those within their community where they see it's appropriate. So this time we've decided that all three are going to do the same stuff, even my daughter's community, but at GWAC that was impossible to have 12 communities that were all going to teach on the same stuff. But GWAC used to run at the traditional, the hierarchical church would run a sermon series with small group notes that was available every week. And so sometimes the micro churches would opt into those, sometimes they'd do their own stuff. But we also built an online place where all those resources that were created every week for the sermon were held. So you could do ones from the current series, or you could actually look back and find a whole lot of resources. Say if you wanted to look at the book of James, here was the last time we did a teaching series on James, here's all the small group material related to it, and you can just download that and then take and use what's most helpful in your space. So that was part of the resourcing, is we'd provide a lot of teaching material, and people could pick and choose what they needed to do. And a part of that is their reporting out. So when we did the Missional Leaders Days and people were planning what they're going to do, they'd be thinking about, okay, where are people at in our community in terms of discipleship? What do we need to be looking at? And then they would plan and report out on that, and we'd help to resource them to do that.